So what I was writing, I still didn't complete the article yet. I'm still editing the article. And I'm saying in it, often sisters reach out to me seeking guidance on dream interpretation. And many feel their lives can't move forward until they solve the mystery behind their dreams. Some might even make significant life decisions based on their interpretations or the interpretation of a dream, or perhaps their own interpretation, looking for signs that maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent them. This is how they would interpret it as. While I acknowledge that there is validity to dream interpretation, and of course there's evidence in Quran and Sunnah. But unfortunately, what is very common in where sisters would make obvious mistakes under the pretense that it was a sign that they had seen in a dream or someone interpreting their dream, perhaps things like getting married or getting a divorce and said, well, got that in a dream. And it's really important to mention that when you're talking about dream interpretation, you don't base life decision choices, and of course, making life decisions on a dream interpretation, which many times would be, I would say, not based on, let's call it hard science or solid evidences. It's an interpretation to a dream, and certainly this interpretation can go right and wrong, but let's just assume that it carried a lot of validity, that the interpretation that it was based on valid things. Okay, but it's important to say that before we talk about dream interpretation, it's important to mention that number one, that science is not necessarily a hard science or a solid science. Let me say the word solid science. In other words, the interpretation itself contains a lot of, let's say, ambiguity. The interpretation itself is not necessarily, let's call it, where you basically are so sure that you've got the resources, that this is an accurate 100%, 100%, I guess, an accurate interpretation, and therefore you're going to act upon that. What would be more accurate to act upon is basically the data that you live within your life. The data, whether we're speaking about, for example, you're getting a potential candidate for marriage. You're going to look at the information that you have in regards to this potential candidate, whether we're speaking about, their religion, their piety, or how seriously they take their religious matters, or two, for example, the job that they have, how long had they had been doing this job for, their future plans, their relationship with the family, their legal status, all these different things. That's what is considered going to be your basis, the data that is going to be the basis that you will depend on your decision making, and not necessarily, yes, I got some sign from Allah where my car didn't work, or I went to the store and all of a sudden I slip on the floor. That's a sign that, hey, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want me to, I guess, approve or accept this marriage candidate. And it's really important to mention that a lot of the dreams are going to be explaining certain things within your life right now. So we're talking about perhaps a situation that is happening to you or happening to someone else, but that's not necessarily going to tell you that, okay, this is what I want you to make as decisions. And therefore, when you want to make a decision, it's important to make the decisions based on the data, and therefore to consider following a certain plan in your life is supposed to be based on data and remain inconsistent or remain consistent and steadfast, of course, in your actions. In other words, what choices you make, what, of course, hidayah and all of that, that's actually a main thing. And following hidayah and staying steadfast and consistent within your hidayah is the most important thing. And when I mean by hidayah, What I mean by hidayah is basically the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're talking about making sure that the choices that you're making are basically the choices that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is recommending for you, and not necessarily you living a delusion or a fantasy that somehow this is basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants of you, therefore He's sending you some kind of a message. The message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent you is that you want to be one, remain in hidayah, or be consistent in what choices that you make to make sure that you're consistent with your hidayah. So it's either that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning you that, hey, you shouldn't be making such decisions, they're not for your hidayah, or that you want to be, if you're on hidayah, then be consistent with the hidayah. So just wanted to share that one. I know it's a little off topic and, well, not little, but completely off topic in tafsir, but inshallah we'll continue going with tafsir. So we were doing these ayat, of course, with tafsir, ayah 46, and still going, of course, and what we're doing is basically tafsir al-Qurtubi. And we went over Tafsir al-Qurtubi in terms of these ayat قَفَّيْنَا عَلَى أَثَرِهِمْ بِعِيسَى بْنِ مَرْيَمَ مُصَدِّقًا. And we talked about, I guess, the etymology, let's say it that way, the roots for each and every single, almost each and every single key word. And we talked about these key words, مُصَدِّقًا, and the whole idea was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the prophets and the messengers with the same message, at least the same general message, the same aqidah, but then they had basically different tashri'at, and we went in details in terms of shir'atan wa minhaja. We went in details with different legislatures that the prophets had come with, and we also talked about وَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, that this is basically referring not to them ruling in legislature, but this was more referring to a specific prophecy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent within the Bible and in the Gospels about the Prophet ﷺ, and that they were supposed to adopt and supposed to be taking that prophecy because that's what the Bible itself was telling them to do, which is basically take the Prophet ﷺ as the prophet and as the messenger and as the one that will have the final revelation. And right there, أنزلنا إليك الكتاب بالحق مصدقا لما بين يديه من الكتاب, of course, that the Quran was the final revelation and containing, of course, whether we're speaking about the legislature or whether we're speaking about the different parts of Revelation in terms of creed and so forth. And therefore, we went in details about muhaiminan alayh, and we said, is it muhaiminan alayh to mean superior? Is it muhaiminan to mean in terms of course, let's say abrogating the previous revelations, or is it muhaiminan to mean mu'taman, to actually mean that it was giving trust, was basically completing, it was basically confirming what was already in the previous revelations. And we said that different interpretations, and I think it's what's more important than what is the preponderant ruling in terms of, let's say, the most accurate interpretation, is really understanding how, and this is really key, understanding how the scholars of tafsir might use different methods, or at least how they get to those interpretations. So when we break down, for example, and we said muhaiminan, and I guess this one was key in where we saw that when they went on to bring about the interpretation to muhaiminan, we looked at the word and we went in details, and where number one, we said, well, here we go. In Lugha Arabiya, the word muhaymin actually means in where something is superior. So we looked at the Lugha Arabiya, and then we also said that there was another qira'ah. So this is very important. Why do we have variant qira'at? The variant qira'at are also are also following, let's call it, the chain of narration. In other words, we're here getting another narration or another way of reciting the words. In other words, another word to help us understand. And this word is, number one, that it was valid, that the Prophet ﷺ had actually recited it. In other words, that adds on to understanding the meaning and enhances the meaning or the interpretation that we're trying to seek. That's number two, and where using al-qira'at is extremely important in tafsir. Number three, going to, of course, the different interpretations that were done by the Sahaba. This is also important because they definitely had, number one, the best knowledge in Arabic, and number two, they had the best, of course, relationship with, of course, the interpretation for the Quran, because they had recent and the most recent, let's call it recent explanation in the most recent interpretation that was done by the Prophet ﷺ to them, which actually makes it, I guess, getting a higher level of accuracy in terms of interpretation than an interpretation that we would find later, whether because of, let's call it, the different influences that might have influenced the interpretation, perhaps influences, we're talking about maybe language influences, let's say, coming from different tribes or perhaps coming from different languages. So that's number one. Number two, in where the different influences, in where personal choices and personal biases, perhaps sometimes affecting and influencing the accuracy. And certainly number three, when we're speaking about in terms of what will affect the interpretation in terms of course, how accurate in where the relationship and how it traces back to the Prophet ﷺ. So we saw that piece of it. And the other part was the part about Lugha Arabiya. Now that one was key, although al-Mubarrid had basically said its etymology, that it goes back to mu'aymin. It was really key for you to actually see this as an example in where how different interpretations can go back to different, let's call it, different traces, whether in qira'at, the words of a Sahabi, and where what they interpreted in number three, which is in Lugha Arabiya, and how they basically broke down the root and what that word actually comes from. And then that affected or basically influenced the mufassir or the scholar of tafsir in what interpretation they would make for that word or for that ayah. So just keep that in mind, in where at least let's look at it as a paradigm that we understand how tafsir actually happens and what basis do they actually base their tafsir on, because this is important in order to bring about this paradigm, let's say it that way, in understanding the different methods of tafsir down the road. Two other ayat in order to help us make sure that when we make any tafsir, that it's not based on our own fantasy, or it's not based on how we feel about it, or it's not based on, well, let's bring about some mystical interpretation. And this is extremely important because during our times, this is really common, where people think of tafsir being not hard, and therefore they can put their own intake, whether create a mystical interpretation or perhaps create their own interpretation of how they feel about it, or perhaps, well, this word might mean some metaphorical wording, and therefore let's basically create this narrative or this kind of interpretation, and not realize that tafsir is a very intricate science, and you cannot just make your own interpretation thinking that, well, I basically got some kind of personal guidance, or I got the gut feelings, or I got some kind of an intuition to interpret things this way, whether mystical or metaphorical or etc. That no, this is a very intricate science. Each and every single word they basically had studied and had evidences for each and every single interpretation. So it was either going to be based off a qira'ah, or it was going to be based on a sahabi, or it was going to be based on lugha arabiya, or certainly based on hadith to tell me that this is what that interpretation is. Therefore, you're not going to create your own interpretation and your own intuition for the interpretation. So this is really important to just, I guess, keep in mind, because I see that often, and this is extremely dangerous, because this is part in where التقول على الله. Wait, what does that even mean? التقول على الله is basically editing and attributing words to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he did not say. And this is what the Jews and the Christians had actually done. They had attributed, they had claimed that the Prophet ﷺ or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said certain words, and then they claimed that they have religious basis for such interpretation. And then later on, of course, they would tell and basically start proselytizing such interpretations that they're divine based. So this is at-taqawwul ala Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically considered that there is nothing worse than at-taqawwul ala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically considered that even the interpretations that the Jews and the Christians that they had made, and it was the rabbis, it was the priests, it was basically supposed to be somehow, let's call it a scholastic and a scholarly interpretation, and that this interpretation was basically the main reason to why many were deviant, and many deviated away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they created their own interpretation that is not based on evidences. And when we say create an interpretation, we're talking about one in where whether the interpretation, keep this one in mind, whether the interpretation created some form of, well, this is how I feel about it, therefore what you're doing is that you're canceling out the actual words, the literal words, and what they had come with. Because if you're making up an interpretation, that means you're wiping away a certain interpretation. It's that simple. That means you're wiping out a certain interpretation. You're canceling out the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're putting your interpretation basically to be that interpretation that replaces what the words really contained. That's what it means. Number two is that when you make such an interpretation, it doesn't necessarily mean only that you're canceling out the actual words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then you are emptying the words of what they mean and basically filling it with your own words. And what you're then doing is that you are changing and twisting the words to basically suit your own interpretation, your own wording, and then therefore you are doing what is called tahrif. So tahrif is actually two kinds. There's, which is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about in what the Jews and the Christians were doing, يحرفون الكلمة من بعد مواضعه, or يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه. So it's two kinds. There's the kind of tahrif. Let me write that word down. Okay, so when we're speaking about tahrif, there's the kind of tahrif. Let's write that word. right there, and where the word is tahrif. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the Jews and the Christians doing tahrif. Well, what is tahrif? Tahrif comes from the root harafa. And the word harafa, the word harf, the letter, all right? So harafa also means to shift away, okay? The word harafa also means to shift away. So when you're doing tahrif, you are basically shifting away, whether we're talking about the actual wording. In other words, you're replacing a word with another word, or there's another type of meaning in where tahrif al-ma'na, you're shifting away the meaning. So you could be shifting away the actual word in where instead of putting a certain word, for example, you're putting a different word, a completely different word. So that's one type of tahrif, changing the whole meaning. The other part or the other way of doing tahrif is basically by changing the meaning. So you're canceling out an interpretation, canceling out a meaning, or you're leaving the actual words there, but you're replacing what they actually mean with a different interpretation that you are inducing that the words themselves are not saying. So that's another form of tahrif. So keep this one in mind, because the science of tafsir is not whatsoever something that you can create. I have the intuition. I can feel. I can imagine. It's not an imagination. It's a very detailed ilm. It's very detailed, and in the Quran, you could see that the words themselves are each containing one, let's call it detailed, intricate meaning, in where we cannot in any way shift it and try to put our own feelings about it, because that would be a form of tahrif. Let's continue right there. وَأَنِحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. أَنِحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. Now, of course, when we're looking at أَنِحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we talked about in details, is that right there saying, well, and rule amongst them with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. Was that necessarily abrogated in where giving the Prophet ﷺ the option? And we actually went in details with this, so I'm not going to go in, let's see, right there in where we went in details. We said the part that the scholars had actually mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the Prophet ﷺ the option to rule by of course, the Christians and the Jews, by what was revealed onto Islam, basically the Islamic legislature. So if we're, as Muslims, we're ruling basically over the Christians and the Jews, all right, are we going to rule by the Quran and Sunnah, or are we going to use their legislature? Or are we going to say, well, I'm sorry, but we're not going to be ruling within your case? So is that right there an option for us, or do we have to rule by Islam, period? So this is that part in where some scholars actually said that that was abrogated, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, and rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed, in where they regarded that فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ أَوْ أَعْرَضْ عَنْهُم, that this piece right there, أَوْ أَعْرَضْ عَنْهُم, or turn away from them. In other words, giving him the option to not rule. They considered that this piece, just these two words right there, أعرض عنهم أو أعرض عنهم, that's basically abrogating فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. I'm not going to go in details with that, but just to see how each and every single word is basically really, let's say, critical in its certain position, in where we can't necessarily just give about, our own interpretation, or even dependent on English translation or whatever translation, or even one book of tafsir and say, well, here's what I got and here's how I would feel about it. All right, let's see. And of course, look at this one. In where to claim, look at this word. He said, and to claim that this was abrogated, وَأَنِحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, and therefore saying أَوْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْهُم is basically ruling off and considering that with this one, أن يحكم بينهم بما أنزل الله, rule amongst them by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that word doesn't apply anymore because it was more optional. So right there, Ibn al-Arabi, look at this, because if you're going to say abrogated, there are 4 different conditions. And he said there are 4 different conditions in order for you to have a valid opinion or a considerable claim that this was abrogated. It's very important to consider these 4 different conditions. And part of these conditions is that in order to claim that one of them was abrogated, in other words, you have to know which text came first. In other words, you've got to know the chronology for that text, because one of them canceled out the application of the other. So if you don't know when this was revealed, and you don't know when the other one was revealed, then you cannot claim that that later one was later and that one basically canceled out the practice of the other one, unless you know the history that for sure that one was revealed basically after. It doesn't mean that they have to know the exact date and the exact year and all of that, but at least know that this was applied, this was revealed later, and therefore its ruling basically is to be canceling out the previous application. All right. And of course, we don't know. And he said, وَهَذَا مَجْهُولٌ مِنْ هَاتَيْنِ الْآيَتَيْنِ. And certainly this was actually ambiguous, and we didn't really know the timing for both of those ayat. So to somehow claim that this was abrogated is actually requiring evidence. So it's not just any word. And that's where we could see the scholars in where they won't just accept just an interpretation of saying, well, this one probably canceled out that one. No, we need a date. This isn't any joke. This is a real serious issue here. We're talking about the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, أَنُحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ, in where if you basically would rule by you would rule by them, you would have to rule by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. And وَحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, let's stop at this one, and where وَحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, well, be careful, and warning him from the people of Quraysh to basically somehow cause a fitna. What is a fitna anyways? Well, a fitna is, let's go back to the root. When we say fatana, okay, so we know first that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says wahdharhum. Okay, so when you say wahdharhum, the root comes from ha dha ra, and this is to give a warning. So to ha dha ra, in where to give a warning, to basically caution you of something. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling him, you got to be cautious. So what does it mean to be cautious? What am I going to do? So basically, I have to see, one, the implications of my choices, in where is it matching their choices? If so, then what you didn't realize is that their pressure did probably have an influence in how you interpreted, in what actually motivated you to making certain choices. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, وَحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, how am I going to know whether I was basically affected by them or not? Well, look at the consequence. Did you follow their path? Did you follow their choices? Were you somehow on the same, let's say, direction that they were heading towards? So you might not know that right now, but when you ask yourself 5 years from now, 3 years from now, or where is it really going to lead you? Well, that's how you would know in where wahdharhum, in where by being cautious, in looking down from the point that you're in where this is taking you, that's how you would know that you're on the wrong path. This is al-hadar. What is al-fitna? Hold on, we're going to get to there. What is al-fitna? So the word fatana actually means to expose to a certain challenge. This is in general, to expose to a certain challenge. Okay, then what? Well, in Lugha Arabiya, we would use such exposure specifically and most commonly in when we're dealing with gold. Gold, what does that have to do with anything? So when you basically extract gold and you excavate for gold in the mines, the gold is basically mixed with pebbles, with soil, with different things. And you would see that in order to get the gold, they would have to expose it on heat. They would basically have to put that gold along with the pebbles, along with all these different things that they would get from earth and their mining. And then they would put it over heat in order to basically let the gold melt. And certainly the pebbles and the rocks, they're not going to melt. So when the gold would melt, they would basically get fine gold, in other words, pure gold that is separated from all the different rocks, pebbles, and all the different things that the earth would basically have. So that's what fitna is. So fitna is many times, of course, we would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala إذا أحب المؤمن إذا أحب المؤمن ابتلاه, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a believer, he would basically test them. Why test them? Why not just give them a reward? If you really love the person, just give them a reward without putting them through different tests. So the different tests were going to basically remove all the different contaminations. That's what it's supposed to do. In other words, it's supposed to refine you. It's supposed to refine you. So that moment when you probably had lost your son, or God forbid, or you probably lost your health, got cancer, or whatever it is, that moment in where it was supposed to refine you. If you're a true believer, that was going to take away all the different things that you might have connected yourself with, perhaps maybe wealth that you were so connected with, or perhaps maybe the life that you were so hooked on to, in where that was going to take away all those different things, and we're going to take away all the different things that you had depended on, that you had lived in this dunya, in wanting to seek more of, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take it away in order to fine and refine you, that you would only have one thing that you are concerned about, that you are in deep love with, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is wanting akhirah, which is wanting Jannah. So you might be exposed to certain hardships in order to take away any contamination or anything that might not make you fine. So it's refining you exactly the way that you would refine gold in order to make sure that you basically gain better value by taking away all the different things that would basically contaminate the richness of your iman. That's really, just thinking about that, in where the scholar said, when the Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا أَحَبَّ الْمُؤْمِنَ ابْتَلَاهُ, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a believer, he would test them, in where to say he would test the believer. To say he would test the believer is basically to tell them that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closing all the doors on that person, to let them know that there's only one door that you really need to run to. You usually run away from things, but you run to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the things that you would fear, you run away from. You're afraid of dark, you run away from it. A dog comes barking at you, you basically run away from it. Anything that you're afraid of, you run away from it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the only one that if you're afraid of Him, that you run to Him. So when you look at وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, let's see right there, what was the story? Ibn Ishaq had said that Ibn Abbas had said, اجتمع قوم من الأحبار, a group of different rabbis, and amongst them was Ibn Surya, who was probably a rabbi, and Ka'b ibn Asad, another rabbi, Ibn Saluba, Sha's ibn Qais, who was actually famous. All right, they basically had gathered, and they went to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, let's go to Muhammad ﷺ, and perhaps we can somehow, I guess, naftinahu an dinihi, in other words, redirect him, or perhaps get him off the path of his religion, because at the end of the day, he's human. So they came to him and they said, "Oh Muhammad, you know that we're rabbis from the Jews, and that if we were to follow you, no one from the Jews would basically go against us. And there are certain people between us and them, basically some tension, in where فَنُحَاكِمُهُمْ إِلَيْكَ, we'll basically bring them to you, and we're just going to let you be the person to judge between us, that is. And then we want you to rule in our favor. And if you do rule in our favor, we'll basically believe in you." So the Prophet ﷺ refused this, and he basically had the ayah that was revealed onto him, which is this ayah that we're doing, وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, and be careful, and of course warning the Prophet ﷺ from following their favor, or from following their interest, or from basically following what they are pressuring the Prophet ﷺ. So what they were basically wanting the Prophet ﷺ to do, they were wanting him to basically rule in their favor, and then therefore they were promising that, hey, we're rabbis here, and we have a great influence on our people. If you basically would rule in our favor, we will somehow intimidate our people to believe in you. But we want one thing for you to do, which is rule in our favor, and we have the power to control our people, because we'll basically, as rabbis, we'll tell them to believe in you. So that sounded, of course, somehow, I guess, sounded intimidating. It sounded rather, hey, maybe if I were to rule in their favor, not a big deal, and somehow I would get, all these people joining Islam, because these are the rabbis right there, in where they have great influence within their society, and perhaps we can gain a lot more people than just a simple rule. So not a big deal. But of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ. In other words, this isn't saying that the Prophet ﷺ was going to be falling in fitna. But when you say وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, أي مِنْ أَجْلِ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, in other words, in order to basically cause a fitna. So it doesn't mean that the Prophet ﷺ was going to fall in fitna, going to fall in deviation, but this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically telling him, be careful from the different methods that they might use to intimidate you to be deviant. Okay, and this is important in where, well, how do I know that I am intimidated in any way to fall in this fitna? How do I know whether this is going to be a fitna to me or not? Well, you need to look at your path, your choices, the decision making, all of those different things in the people that you hang out with. This could be those signs. You want to know if you're falling in fitna or not? Well, ask yourself, how much time are you spending in doing 1, 2, 3, for example? And your friends, who are they? Your lifestyle, is it matching, and is it, let's say, similar to the lifestyle of munafiqeen, or is it similar to the lifestyle of mu'mineen, or is it similar to the lifestyle of salihin, or perhaps even better? Or is it similar to the lifestyle of kuffar? If the lifestyle of kuffar, whether, hey, the way you talk, your words, I guess the practices, where you hang out, the amount of time that you spend in ritual, the amount of time you spend in your spirituality, your life, the choices that you make, what basis are they based on? And certainly your family, and what, in other words, let's call it the social relations that you would surround yourself with. Who are they? What background do they come from? What kind of life are they living? What kind of ideas do they share? How are you dressed? How are you eating? What kind of things do you expose your sight to, your sight to? What kind of things do you listen to? All of those things are going to tell you how close or far you are away from the path of the Salihin. So the more you would create a checklist, the more that you have in common with, let's call it the kuffar or the mu'mineen, that's going to determine whether you are going the direction of fitna or not. So if you have a lot of those check marks, and where, yes, I feel closer to, let's say, my XYZ friends, and XYZ friends are not Muslim, and XYZ friends, in other words, the choices, their lifestyle, the entertainment, all of that is basically something that you're finding more compatibility with, well, then you really have to question yourself. Are you really going to stay within your iman? Or are you down the road going to be losing your iman? So that's where we would say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the Prophet sallam, وَحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ. Where even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling the Prophet sallam, and be careful, warning him, be careful from them deluding you or putting you on the path of delusion. And where and when did it say that? عَنْ بَعْضِ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ. From what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed onto you. In other words, you know it by the rules or by the practices and by the choices that you make. The choices that you make in life are going to determine what vision you carry. They're going to determine what purpose, in what direction are you heading towards. The choices that you make. What choices did you make in entertainment? What choices did you make in life decision matters? What choices did you make in why you are getting married to this person? Why you think he's a good match, and why you're rejecting this person, or why you're choosing to put your children in this kind of school and not another kind of school? Why are you choosing to basically take that person as a friend and not the other person? Well, that is basically right there. عن بعض ما أنزل الله إليك. Are you really right there heading towards what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had determined was the path of guidance? Or are you choosing based off another vision, which is the vision to perhaps get somehow more followers, getting acceptance, somehow fitting in without you realizing? In other words, it becomes another form of peer pressure. So what they tried to do, at least those rabbis, what they tried to do was somehow of, let's call it political pressure, or let's call it as well in where social pressure, in where, hey, you follow us, you basically would rule in our favor, we'll have more and more people follow you, but you would have to just rule in our favor, because at the end of the day, what the Jews wanted to I guess see that the Prophet ﷺ was definitely keen on getting more followers, more people to accept Islam. So they basically thought, well, here, since this is his concern, then therefore we'll show him that we have the ability to give him what he's looking for, which is getting more followers. But the Prophet ﷺ was not seeking more followers for the sake of followers. He was seeking followers, but that was on the condition to basically spread the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spread the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spread the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there was no way that he was seeking followers at the expense of giving up on the revelation itself. So in other words, the main purpose was to spread the revelation. The main purpose was to let people know of the revelation, but it wasn't going to be at the expense. Of course, it wasn't going to be at the expense of getting more people. That wasn't the goal. And that's the same thing. In where your goal is not necessarily to gain more acceptance or more people and more followers. The goal is to stay steadfast on the principles and the revelations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regardless of how people feel about it, how intimidated people are to follow or not follow. At the end, just say the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا. Let's continue right there. فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا. If they turn away. Let me look at this part of it first before we would go there, and where they said, we said that it was Ibn Ishaq that had mentioned this. Let's go 5 and see, does it really have any evidence to support that? So al-Tabari mentioned it, al-Bayhaqi mentioned it, and all were based on that traces back of the chain of narration, Ibn Ishaq, about, and basically going through this chain of narration. All right, and that was basically mentioned that was the reason, but they didn't really see how accurate that was, but you could see that it was off Ibn Abbas. In other words, it didn't really necessarily have a direct chain of narration in terms of going back to the Prophet ﷺ saying, so this isn't a hadith. Okay, this isn't a hadith, but this was more of an athar. This was more of an athar where Ibn Abbas had basically said that this was the reason for the revelation. So Ibn Abbas, we've got the chain of narration that goes all the way to Ibn Abbas, and that it was mentioned in Sirat ibn Hisham. What is Sirat ibn Hisham? So Sirat ibn Hisham is the first book on Sirah, on the biography of the Prophet ﷺ. And, well, it really Sirat ibn Ishaq, but that one had gone missing. So, of course, you see Sirat ibn Ishaq and Sirat ibn Hisham. One is basically summarizing the other. Okay, so let's look at the al-fitna. Al-fitna, we talked about in terms of fitna, we said that al-fitna is to expose on hardship. And here we go, asl al-fitna al-ikhtibar. So the basis and the etymology and the main source of what the word fitna actually means, to test. And of course, when we look at the word fitna, it actually differs. So not every single time you come across the word fitna in the Quran, you just go and say, hey, this is what it means. It just means that, and therefore it's all about challenge in that way. So some words, and of course, they would have different meanings based on the context, but it would really go back to the same etymology. So let's see right there, in where you could see, in where احذرهم أن يفتنوك, in where al-fitna could be. So in other words, remember when we said, well, you would look at your lifestyle and see how matching and how compatible it is with the mu'mineen lifestyle or with the kuffar. So what, in terms of what? So those are what the words fitna are going to basically help us understand what the fitna would really be in terms of, in other words, the categories. So here, right here, وَاحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, in other words, whether they are, it could also mean in where they are يَصُدُّوكَ أَوْ يَرُدُّوكَ, basically turning you away from guidance, or basically creating barriers from you wanting perhaps to apply Islam. So they're creating different barriers from you applying Islam. And this is important. So in other words, when we're speaking about the societies in where perhaps France, okay, in where you can't apply Islam, you can't apply hijab, there are so many different things. So that's a place of fitna. let's say in America as well, in order to raise your children based on the principles of Islam, what are you going to get? Well, the government right now, of course, in certain states, not all states, but in certain states right now, they're basically having direct access to the children, infiltrating their minds, and certainly, of course, indoctrinating them and so forth. So in that situation, you would know that that's a place of fitna. So anything that is acting as a barrier from you in one, whether it's in applying Islam or in teaching Islam or in living your Islam, that would be a place of fitna. Well, what is fitna? Whether we're speaking about al-fitna can be in shirk. So if you're not able to apply Islam, in where, of course, we could see, for example, in perhaps in different countries, where if you're discovered to be Muslim, you could be tortured, you could be going through perhaps some form of losing your job, all of that. That's a form of fitna. Then in that situation, if you're not capable of embracing your Islam and applying Islam in terms of tawheed or even practicing Islam, then in that situation, if you have the ability to basically face it and basically fight it, well, then do so. If you don't have the ability to fight it, and all you could do is right now bring about, let's say, enlightenment, awakening, awareness about it, and you're capable of doing that, then do so. But even talking about it, but let's say even talking about it was going to probably put you in danger, then in that situation, well, if you're capable of leaving the place, then leave the place. And we know that in different parts of the world, that a lot of the Muslims, they basically lost the traces of their Islam, like the Muslims in Brazil, South America. A lot of them are basically from Syria and Lebanon that migrated there, and right now they don't know much of their Islam, to be honest. Many of them, they would have the traces all the way back to Muslim parents and Muslim grandparents and all of that. And then right now they're Catholic. Same thing when you're talking about a lot of I guess the Muslims in Spain. They know that their ancestry traces back all the way to the Moors, or at least to the Muslims that basically had their ancestry living in Al-Andalus, but they were forced into, of course, Catholicism and Christianity, and they don't really know much about their roots, in other words. And same thing when you're looking at the African Americans, for example. African Americans, many of them, they basically had Muslim roots. Many of them had Muslim roots. And of course, they were pressured. And of course, I guess the African Americans, they had it in a very different way, in where they had no option. How are you going to run away? How are you going to find a place? They tried as much as they can to hold on to their Islam. And if you go back to the book Servants of Allah by Sylvie Dio, I think I could never forget that book, in where the effort, the amount of torture that the African Americans had endured to hold on to any sign of their Islam. That's why until the time of today, you would have African Americans, their names are different than of course the white Americans. A lot of their names, they're basically, I would say, more of tahrif. It was really trying to keep some of the heritage. So it's Alicia instead of Aisha or Aisha, because of course the white masters did not allow them to keep their names, did not allow them to keep any sign or any heritage that leads to the signs, or at least any way of them maintaining any root to their Islam. So they would basically keep at least the sound of that, what basically is a sign of their identity, but give a small tahrif. Alicia, or different names, of course. It wasn't just that. It was trying to, and even when you're talking about the African American accent, for example, the African American accent in where it has its own structure. Even the vocabulary is actually different. The vocabulary is different. It was really interesting. I was coming across a study in where the African American language was actually trying to mimic, and it traces back to some African languages. So they wanted to keep roots and keep the traces of their African roots. So they would use some of those English words, but they would keep their African structure, the language that they had actually come from. It's really interesting. It's like they tried as much as they can to maintain something about their heritage. But of course, later on, they were pressured to change their roots, their Islamic roots, their identity from a name, or even the words, or even the salah, etc. And in the book, Servants of Allah, you really got to go back to that book. But just keep a box of napkins next to you, because you're really, really going to cry. The amount of pressure was unbelievable. The amount of torture was unbelievable, where a lot of those African Americans, in order to emasculate them, they would rape the men in front of their family members, just to take away their honor. So they would rape the men, and rape the women, and torture them in the ugliest ways. And they even consider that they don't have any feelings, believe it or not. When you're talking about the study of OBGYN, a lot of those were actually done on African American women, because and of course with no anesthesia used, because they believed that these Africans didn't have the nerves, and therefore they didn't feel feelings. They didn't have any feelings. They couldn't feel pain. So they would perform surgeries while they were basically completely awake and no anesthesia. Just imagine that. Medical studies were performed with this whole mentality that these people did not have feelings. Just imagine that. And imagine, these people, they wanted to hold on to their Islam for a very long time. But of course, later on, they did carry some roots, and were recognized that it goes back to Islam, but then they created the Nation of Islam. And subhanAllah, I mean, when you look at, I guess, the integrity, the sincerity that Malcolm X, I think he didn't get the appreciation that he deserves. Malcolm X, and were doing his own studies, and further trying to get to, well, where are my roots from? And then finally becoming Sunni Islam, or Sunni Muslim. And from becoming Sunni Muslim and choosing Sunni Islam, in where that was what his studies basically led him to, in where this is how far we were stripped away from our own heritage, from our own identity, from our own religion, from anything that would basically lead us to knowing our own roots, and where this is how far this is a fitna right there. I know it's not easy for everyone to just leave, but subhanallah, just keep that one. And where وَالْفِتْنَةُ أَكْبَرُ مِنَ الْقَتْلِ, الفتنة, in where you could see in where shirk, الفتنة أكبر من القتل, in where shirk, of course, is even far worse than al-qatl, than killing. In other words, let's say we're seeing some people, of course, in the Uyghurs, for example, in China. And by the way, I'm getting some education here. I'm meeting a lot of Chinese Muslims here. And I didn't know that there were a lot of Chinese Muslims that were outside of that Xinjiang area and a lot of those. So I met a lot of Chinese Muslims that told me that there were whole cities and villages where those Chinese, it's a whole cities and villages of Muslim Chinese.
SubhanAllah,
They have
that's
been
cool.
Muslim for a very long time. We're talking about centuries. I was really surprised. I didn't know about this. And I'm meeting some Muslims and they're like, yes, we're a whole village. And I'm like, wait a minute. So are you part of the Uyghurs? No, 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 we're not. We're actually Chinese Muslims. We have our own towns. We've got our own areas, but we're living under Chinese governance. But we choose to create our little ghettos. And that's what we basically are. And I'm like, how long have you guys been Muslim? Did you convert? Said no. We had been Muslim for centuries. And why don't we know about these people? That's a different story. How did they manage to maintain their Islam? Beautiful hijabis and very beautiful, to actually see a Chinese Muslim and mashallah, I mean, see them maintaining their Islam under such, we know that China is is one of those dictatorships where it's really censoring the movement of each and every single person within their country. So it's really far more worse than the censorship that perhaps America and Israel are doing. Okay, وقاتلوهم حتى لا تكون فتنة. And let's see, the other fitna is al-ibra. What is al-ibra? Al-ibra is basically the lesson to be learned. So here وقاتلهم حتى لا تكون فتنة, and fight them so it won't be a fitna. What does that mean? So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to fight them so that they would not be a fitna. حتى لا تكون فتنة, or is it in order for them to be a lesson for others to learn? Okay. So what is the context in here? So it's two. Number one, قاتلهم حتى لا تكون فتنة. In other words, basically here, this is telling us to engage in jihad in order to avoid the different, of course, the different problems that might result later in whether it's the ummah being weak or probably, of course, the power of the disbelievers basically overcoming the Muslim power and perhaps pressuring you and using different methods to take away your right to practice your Islam. Or قاتلهم حتى لا تكون فتنة. In other words, well, let others that are somehow trying to seek those and seize those moments to somehow attack the Muslims. Now they're right there. They're seeing that you are basically using your power in forces and that you're strong enough to face any coming threat. In other words, it's a form of proxy war, or it's a form of, of course, in where well, not only proxy war, but that would be basically the type of wars and where before it even becomes a threat, you anticipate that there's going to be a threat. So what do? You basically anticipate that there's going to be a coming threat. In other words, those that are a threat, sometimes you really have to face them in order to let the other threats know that you are strong enough, and therefore you're avoiding other dangers from coming at you. In other words, you're teaching others a lesson. I'm still strong, so don't even try. Right there. حتى لا تكون فتنة. Let's see. لا تجعلنا فتنة للذين كفروا. Ya Allah, don't make us a fitna for الذين كفروا. What does that mean? Ya Allah, don't make us a fitna for the disbelievers, and don't make us a fitna to the transgressors. So what does that mean? Don't make us part of those that would act as a barrier from passing on or letting them know the religion. Is that even possible? How are we going to be a fitna? How is it that we're going to be a fitna? Number one is that we can become a fitna to الذين كفروا if we don't give da'wah. Then we're fitna. Because our presence is basically, if we're not doing our job in doing da'wah, then what we're really here doing is letting them think that there is no place for guidance. So we're a fitna then. Number two, in where we could act as a fitna, number one, we said silent. Number two, in where we're somehow, of course, intimidated to let go of our principles, let go of Islam, because it seems that we're somehow being inclusive, and what we're doing is we're not grounded in our deen, and we're being a fitna to الذين كفروا rather than giving them guidance. We're basically trying to focus so much on somehow fitting in and somehow gaining acceptance that basically we misguided them into finding the right path. So we had become fitna الذين كفروا. And this is, in other words, yes, a Muslim can be a misguidance. Why? They can be a misguidance because they would feel intimidated to either one, not talk about the religion, two, talk about the religion, but interpret it in a way that makes them seem that they're really similar. And this happens a lot with interfaith dialogues, in where they would think that they're right there joining to bring about a Muslim presentation within this interfaith talk. And what they would feel intimidated to do is to present Islam like, hey, we're just like you. See, we're not different. So they would be intimidated to basically speak of Islam, that it is as inclusive, as open-minded, as liberal, as committed to their definition of justice, exactly like the other religions, the other secular statements. And therefore, what those people that were joining in those interfaith talks, what they don't realize is that they were really being a fitna للذين كفروا, because what you were supposed to do is not necessarily wipe away the lines in where for people to identify al-haq from al-batil. What you did in joining such panels, for example, at least expose and bring about those areas and say, well, this is where Islam is. This is how we would basically center around Tawheed. And this is what Islam says. And don't bend Islam and feel intimidated to bend Islam to make it appear that it is civilized based on their interpretation of civilization, or
Would
make
that
it seem
also
modern.
would that also be the case if somebody is just like they just totally have a wrong understanding and portray that, and so the person doesn't really, let's say you're giving
Would be
da'wah.
part of it, Noura. It would be
Yeah.
part of it. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us that when you want to make da'wah, you have to have ilm. You have to have ilm. فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. He said, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَدْعُو اللَّهَ عَلَى بَصِيرٍ. I call for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ala basira. What is basira? Basira, insight. ادعو إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة. You want to call on to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala بالحكمة. What is al-hikmah? Al-hikmah is wisdom. What is wisdom? It's basically by having the ilm. If you don't have ilm, if you don't have the courage to say the truth, well, don't put yourself in such positions. But to somehow remove those lines and to make it seem like, hey, we're all one, everything's cool. See, we're just as civilized, as inclusive, as modern, as open-minded, as liberal as you are. What did you do? You were a fitna. You were not right there being a Muslim representative or giving the presentation on Islam. You were right there trying to represent Islam. You were making your own presentation. You were making your own interpretation and presenting, look at it, it's Islam. Then in that situation, that person was a fitna للذين كفروا. So when we talk about fitna, in where, yes, by being silent, by twisting the religion, twisting the interpretation, and certainly by somehow removing the lines in where what Islam really is, then in that situation, it's what you had done is really sadda an sabilillah. The person had really gotten people off the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so أَنَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. Of course, when we look at right there, let's look at the ayah. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَأَنَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ, and said it before, فَحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ. Now, it's important to mention that in the Quran, yes, you can find repeated statements, and the repetition can sometimes be as a form of emphasis. The repetition can be as a form of course, in other words, it's inducing a new meaning based on the context. So right there, this is certainly an emphasis in where there is no change in the order, in where no, what you need to do is basically rule by the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly whether we're speaking about the ruling in terms of legislature, or whether we're speaking about all the different matters, and where aqidah, representation, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned in terms of tawheed, in terms of monotheism, in terms of what it means to embrace Islam, what it means to embrace justice, what is the definition of justice, what is the definition of family, what is the definition of course, humanhood, and the list goes on. That's basically going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But can it be in where وَحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ, that the Prophet ﷺ didn't necessarily do that on purpose? In other words, he didn't want to necessarily, I guess, get pressured, and he didn't get pressured by the Yahud for sure. We know that. He didn't get pressured. He wasn't intimidated to change the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But is it possible that وَحْذَرْهُمْ أَن يَفْتِنُوكَ was telling him, giving him a warning that be careful from you forgetting certain things, and not necessarily that the Prophet ﷺ was doing it on purpose? In other words, the Prophet ﷺ, is it possible that the Prophet ﷺ might have made certain choices, and not necessarily on purpose, but he might have forgotten? Is it possible that that could happen? So here he said, وَفِي الْآيَةِ دَلِيلٌ عَلَى جواز النسيان صلى الله عليه وسلم، نسيان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، النسيان على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، لأنه قال أن يفتنوك. He said this ayah is an evidence that the Prophet ﷺ, it can happen that the Prophet ﷺ can forget, and not necessarily do it on purpose, that he might have made the choice of what is, I guess, different than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said. But we don't actually have any records of that. So it's really strange how al-Qurtubi would even mention that. We don't have any mention in where the Prophet ﷺ, or actually we do, the case of Dhul Yadayn. Let's mention that story. Dhul Yadayn, in where the Prophet ﷺ was praying Salat al-Fajr. And the Prophet ﷺ prayed Salat al-Fajr, but then he prayed it 1 rak'ah, not 2. So a guy that was named Dhul Yadayn, that was his nickname, he either had, well, it was some kind of mutation, some kind of a genetic mutation. He either had really short hands or really long hands, but he was actually called the person with the hands. In other words, there was some kind of disability that he had in his hands, but he was actually called the guy with the hands. After the Prophet ﷺ finished Salah, and it was a jama'ah, then this Sahabi, from the end of the line, basically goes up front, crosses all the lines, and tells the Prophet ﷺ, أَقَصَرَتِ الصَّلَاةَ أَمْ نَسِيتَ? Did the Salah get shorter, or did you forget? Now the Prophet ﷺ was confused. What is he talking about? So he turns around and he says, is Dhul Yadayn right? And they said, yes, you actually prayed 1, not 2. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ turns around, Allahu Akbar, and basically brings another rak'ah. Okay? Just 1 rak'ah in order to make up for 2. Okay? So here's the Prophet ﷺ forgetting. Okay? Here's the Prophet ﷺ basically forgetting, and it wasn't on purpose that he basically had shortened the prayer. So if we're talking about that one, but there was no record of the Prophet ﷺ somehow, of course, ruling a ruling, okay? Ruling a ruling because he had forgotten what the Islamic ruling was. Okay, so that's no record of. But do we have any records of the Prophet ﷺ forgetting? Yes, we do. That was an example. عن بعض ما أنزل الله إليك. In other words, ما أنزل الله إليك, and when we're talking about البعض, this word بعض actually means part. And sometimes when you're looking at عن بعض ما أنزل الله إليك can also mean of all. So it's not necessarily partition. Sometimes in لغة عربية, we could say عن بعض ما أنزل الله إليك to actually mean on all. So the word بعض can mean part and can also mean all. So just, here we go. It said والبعض يستعمل بمعنى الكل. So what does that mean? So in this sentence, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, and be careful, in other words, warning him from letting, of course, the disbelievers intimidate him. So yaftinuk, intimidate. Okay. Off what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, off of some or all of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed onto him. In other words, whether it's some or whether it's all, the ayah would basically, let's say, include it. فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا. Let's move on. فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا. Let's see. Where Ibn al-Arabi actually said, وَصَحِيحْ أَنَّ بَعْض عَلَى حَالِهَا فِي هَذِهِ الْآيَةِ. So Ibn al-Arabi wanted to object and said, well, actually, you didn't necessarily need to say that al-ba'd can also mean all, but it could also mean, for Ibn al-Arabi, he objected, and he said, no, it basically is ba'd to mean part, and you didn't have to somehow, I guess, say it could also mean all, but he said in this sentence, it could just be really staying as, and be careful, or warning the Prophet ﷺ from being intimidated to go off some of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. So al-Qurtubi was saying it could also mean all. Ibn al-Arabi said, well, And why not just leave it as part? That's what the word is saying. So you didn't have to somehow go to another interpretation, because just leave it as is. And where did they get that from? So he said, well, and al-ba'd can mean all as well. And he said, because we could see وَلِأُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ بَعْضَ الَّذِي تَخْتَلِفُونَ فِيهِ. Anywhere in Surah Al-Zukhruf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, and I was sent in order to present or basically bring about a clarification on some of what you were in dispute about. But here he said, well, here, this is not to bring some of that clarification, but this could also mean to bring about all clarifications for what they were in dispute of. So that's basically, of course, what al-Qurtubi wanted to say. Ibn al-Arabi basically said, in fact, look at this one, was Sahih, the respect that they had for the other scholars. In where Ibn al-Arabi said, and what is actually preponderant, what is more accurate, in where Ba'd is basically to stay in the same meaning, in other words, the default meaning in this ayah, in where it was going to be, in where part of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. And what was this pertaining to? They said, well, this is pertaining to the incident that happened in where the people of the Yahud, the Jews, they basically wanted the Prophet ﷺ to rule in certain favors for certain leaders, and therefore not rule based on the Torah, which is stoning for the incident of zina, because that's what the Torah was even ruling. And that's what the Quran was ruling. If a person is, or at least Islamic ruling, if a person has a marriage experience, then therefore, if they were to commit adultery, then therefore the punishment would be that they would be stoned to death. And that's what the Torah was ruling. So Ibn Arabi was saying, well, Ba'd would stay the same, because what this was referring to the incident, this particular incident, which was when the Yahud, in that particular incident, what they really wanted was the Prophet ﷺ would rule in their favor and not apply the ruling of stoning on to the people that were part of them. Okay. And therefore, they didn't necessarily want to intimidate the Prophet ﷺ from somehow letting go of Islam, but of one piece of the application of criminal law in Islam, just one piece, and not necessarily everything. So that's what Ibn Arabi was basically saying. What this is, the reason why I'm saying this, and where for us to really understand that the science of tafsir is not something that, well, how I feel about it. It's really detailed. And these scholars, even if it's just this word, ba'd, kul, I mean, it's not a big deal. Is it really an issue? Yes, it is an issue. Why? Because this is the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's definitely an issue. Because each and every single word, each and every single letter, each and every single harakah is a serious matter here. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asked us to preserve the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in where to preserve the meaning, in where we can't make our own interpretation. So as someone that believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would really have to take the science of tafsir or the science of fiqh. You take it seriously, and that is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُعَظَّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever glorifies the rituals of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether sha'a'ir Allah to basically mean in the general meaning, sha'a'ir Allah as Hajj or Umrah or etc., or whether sha'a'ir Allah to mean the details of Islam, to glorify it. to respect it, to understand that this isn't something that you would put in your own thoughts and basically somehow like I feel about this and all of that. That's part of Islam. You submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually means you basically trace and search for the trace of how to understand Islam based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, and not necessarily by making and creating your own interpretation. You go back to the Prophet ﷺ, you go back to the signs of Sahaba, you go back to the Lugha Arabiya, because you want to make sure that you get the right translation. You want to make sure that you get the right and accurate interpretation. You want to make sure that you get the right application. Translation, application, and interpretation. Why? Because that's going to be creating a vision. That's the vision. That's the vision in where what you live your life based on. As a Muslim, where are you going with this? That's the purpose that you're living your life based on. That's the purpose. So you take each and every single word, every single letter is a serious matter. So these scholars and these scholars in Tafsir and scholars in fiqh and all of them, you could see they weren't just, oh, well, this is how I feel. No, said, well, here's my evidence. Even if it's just just a small matter, not a big deal. But no, it is a big deal because this is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا. In other words, if they basically rejected your ruling, turned away, then know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ أَن يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِم. In the general terms, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted them or wanted to basically harm them. Is it harm them or is it test them with what? With some of their sins. Is it like that? Well, that's not really that accurate. So what does it mean? Let's see. So in the context of this ayah, in where the Yahud, they basically rejected the Prophet ﷺ. They basically committed treason. They basically tried to kill the Prophet ﷺ. They did a lot of, each and every single tribe has its own story, whether it's Khaybar, Qaynuqa, Nadir, Qurayza, each one had their own story. Okay, so here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, well, we're just right there, let them do what they want to do. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, we're watching them and we're letting whatever choices and whatever dhunub that they are doing later on, it's going to come back to them and it's going to get onto the surface, and that's going to be what is going to be ruling in them. In other words, right there, you had يُعَذِّبُهُمْ بِالْجَلَاءِ وَالْجِزْيَةِ وَالْقَتْلِ. Banu Qurayza, they basically had al-qatl, in where they basically wanted to commit a treason. And what did they do? They basically had collaborated with Quraysh in order to let the people of Quraysh basically go inside Medina. At least they had wanted to do that, but they were discovered. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically brought a storm that led the people of Quraysh basically flee the area. They couldn't continue with their plots. But of course, Bani Qurayza they couldn't get away with it. They knew that they had committed treason. So it was either you're going to become Muslim, or you're going to get killed, or you're going to leave. That's it. Because you could commit a treason. You were going to commit a whole genocide in Medina. So what was that? يُصِيبُهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِم. الجزية or al-jala. At one point, Bani Nadir, you were going to pay al-jizya. They accepted to pay al-jizya. At one point. But then they committed another form of treason, started harming started harming, well, it was said it was a Muslim woman that took off her hijab, and then, of course, another Muslim starts to defend her, and then they basically start fighting the Muslims right there. الجلاء جلاء بني النضير. And of course, Banu and the list goes on and on in terms of, well, you commit a sin, you weren't going to get away with it. Whether we're speaking about it at a community level or whether we're speaking about an individual level. مَن يَعْمَلْ سُوءًا يُجْزَ بِهِ. And that's basically going within the same concept. You do any harm, it's basically going to come back to you. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala أَيُّصِيبَهُمْ بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِمْ. So it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to harm them. No, it's punish. يُصِيبَهُم. Al-isaba can mean to punish. And al-isaba can mean to harm. Al-isaba can mean to inflict pain. Al-isaba can mean to retaliate. Al-isaba can mean to target. Okay? So right there, يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِم, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not cause harm. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not cause harm. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all just. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does punish for a sin someone had committed, whether in this life or in the hereafter. Or the punishment could also be by other people. In other words, it could be, yes, they harmed someone and someone else, I don't know, they somehow get in a relationship with this person, and this person, from being, I had the weirdest case, a little off subject. I had the weirdest case one time come to me. I could never forget this case. So this woman was married to this guy. But this woman, obviously it was not normal, but she would always hit her husband, literally, just hit her husband, and with a baseball bat, with shoes, anything that her hands could hold, anything that she could find in front of her. If she's angry, she would just smash her husband with it. That's it. If he didn't listen to her, got her angry, provoked her in any way, boom, she's going to beat up her husband. Ironically, this man loved his wife. And this woman hated her husband. She got divorced. Why? Not because he wanted to divorce her, but because she wanted someone that was more manly. That's how she described it. Sure thing. She divorced her husband, and then she got married to a person who's abusive. And this guy was constantly beating up his wife, but she loved him dearly. I was really confused.
That
How?
doesn't make any sense at all.
It doesn't make sense, but you know what, Nora? What it really reveals is that she and her ex, it was something with their upbringing. So you could see, I started investigating, why would you actually love someone that is abusive? And she said, he's more manly. I said, how is it more manly to actually be abusive? Were you as a child, is that how you grew up as a child, in where you had seen your father constantly beating your mother? And she said, yes. I said, that explains it. That explains it. And that's a thing. The father, and the way he deals with his wife, he's basically letting his daughter know that that's where, and that's what makes a good relationship. That's what it means to be manly. So she thought that what it means to be manly is to basically be abusive. Ironically, of course, that's not necessarily always the way that we would see, and where abusive relationships, sometimes it can bring about not people accepting abuse, but people that would be, of course, carrying trauma, in where traumatized, perhaps even refusing marriage and completely hating men, and thinking that every single man that you're going to get married to is basically going to be abusive. And of course, this brings in a different thing. So not everybody, I guess, reacts to the different traumas or abuse in the same way. For this case, I could never forget that. In where what happened, well, she used to abuse her husband. It's not enough, and certainly it's not justified to say, well, this is how my parents lived. This is how my father used to treat my mother. Therefore, this is the type of man that I want. At the end, you have to end the cycle. This is not acceptable in Islam. It doesn't give you the justification to harm this man and beat this man. And look what happened. And where, I know it, kind of relates and doesn't relate to this ayah, but in some way, in where you would cause any dhanb, any sin that you would do, it would basically come back to you. And where Salihin used to say, I would know the sin and I would see the effect and the implication of the sin that I had committed on my wife, on my children, and on they would say even on their deb, which basically means a horse or the animal that they would ride on. They would see that it's starting to not go in a smooth way, or that it's bringing in some troubles and problem. Well, that's because it's basically a sin that I had committed. So if something's going wrong, if the marriage is not going right, well, what's the sin that you're committing? Are you involved in riba? Is this why you're constantly at each other's throats? Are you involved in perhaps a certain sin in where you're looking at haram things? And then is that what's bringing in basically the situation in where your kids are going the wrong direction? Are you involved in gambling? Are you looking at porn? Are you looking at haram things? Are you talking to the wrong people? Are you not living your Islam? Because in the end, in where when you look at إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ يُصِيبَهُم بِبَعْضِ ذُنُوبِهِم, in other words, even الصالحين, I mean, even if I were to flip the ayah, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could also give the reward for good things that you would do. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you here, this is a paradigm. If He would basically let the implication of a sin, in where what would the implication of a sin bring? It would bring harm. It would bring pain. Well, that would also mean that the implication of good deeds is going to bring happiness, ease. Simple. It's a paradigm. So if you are acting in salah, in where the Prophet ﷺ, same thing with that idea, with that concept, in where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, you want to keep away the different calamities, make sadaqah. You're going through hardships, calamities, you make sadaqah. What does sadaqah need to do with have to do with any of this? No, that's salihat will basically تطفئ غضب الرب. The different sadaqah, تطفئ غضب الرب. You basically donate. It will basically take away perhaps the anger that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is probably is not content with certain things that you're doing. So what do? You basically give perhaps more istighfar, or perhaps more sadaqah, or perhaps do good things. And what is that going to bring? Well, that's going to bring in more stability. If your children, they're going the wrong direction, yes, definitely work towards making sure that they're doing the right thing. But there's, do your homework in terms of their education. But at the same time, if you're finding that your home is not going through stability, well, what's the sin? We need to figure out what is that sin that we are committing that is basically affecting our daughters or sons or our relationship or our health even, or our wealth. What is that? And that's the same thing. Certain salihat, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said that وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا, and their father was a pious man. What does that have to do with anything? Well, that means the implication of good deeds basically goes farther than even your age. It transcends, it goes beyond even your time. The implication, let's call it the light of the good deed, goes farther than your time, goes farther than your space. The light of the good deed can have an influence and the power to change your future and your children's future and perhaps your grandchildren's future. That's the power of a good deed. And at the same time, the power of sin can also go farther than you. It can go farther than you. Remember when we talked about Bani Israel? The power of sin, what happened? It basically, they just said, اذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically punished them for that and said, what happened? Well, 40 سنة يتيهون في الأرض. For 40 years, because of that word, they basically got lost. يتيهون في الأرض. They basically got lost in this desert of Sinai. 40 years. How did they get lost? Did they get lost in where they basically lost the map? Not necessarily lost the map per se, but it can mean that they lost their focus on what they were really supposed to be doing. They just got into perhaps some divisions amongst themselves, and of course in these tensions, and who knows what it was, that they basically lost focus on what they were supposed to be doing. So that was basically right there the implication for that actual sin or that actual good deed, in where the light transcends or the darkness transcends your space, your time, and certainly yourself. Think of it this way. Anywhere it can go beyond place, anywhere certainly we know it, even in politics, and where, yes, something that probably happened on one side of the world, and then, of course, we're going to see the economy changing on the other side at the other end. And of course, we could see it in the ecosystem, we could see it in economy, we could see it in politics, we can see it in different ends, and where, yes, you cannot, it's really funny. I was listening to I was listening to this lecture, and right now I've been going into the series, the guy that basically was the director for Al Jazeera, Wadah Khanfar. I'm right during these times, I'm basically, I guess, just constantly listening to his lectures. Beautiful and great lectures, I must admit. There was one thing that I listened, so I'll just basically say, I'll say I heard it from him. I don't know how accurate that is, but I heard it from him. And he was talking about that there was this note during certain time in Europe, and I guess it was during the Dark Ages, that they basically had said that the sun was covered, and this whole world was covered, in where we didn't get enough sunshine, and that basically harmed the crops, and the crops basically died out, and the people basically didn't have enough crops, and they didn't harvest food because the plants needed the sun. The sun was covered, and they thought at that time, they basically thought that it was a result of God being angry at them, or some kind of an evil spirit, and they basically didn't know what to do about it and what was the effect of all this. And it was really stretching out into very far places. What they didn't know was that there was a volcanic eruption in Iceland. This volcanic eruption, all the smoke and all of that, it basically stretched out, that a huge volcanic eruption stretched out to a very, I guess, extended amount of area in where it basically had the smoke, and certainly all that eruption basically covered the skies. And that's the thing, in where, you know, they didn't realize that there was on the other side, of course, news wasn't traveling fast enough to let people know what really affected their crops and their life. But that was, hey, there was a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world that, of course, you on the other side were basically not understanding what was the result of all of this. But you just thought that, okay, we're seeing smoke, we're seeing that the skies are basically covered, and we're dying out, our vegetation is dying out, our animals are dying out, we're not finding food and water, but not really understanding, well, it was really on the other side of the world. And yes, and another one, that Anne Mary Schimmel, I came across this really interesting study that Anne Mary Schimmel, who's Anne Mary Schimmel? So Anne Mary Schimmel, she's a German Orientalist, but she studied and mastered like 6 different languages. And she was saying that she had come across a study that was in her book. She's not Muslim. She was fascinated with mysticism, Sufism, and all of that. And she came across this, and she spoke Sanskrit as well. She studied Sanskrit and studied Arabic, studied Turkish, studied Persian, and a great professor. And she said that she came across this manuscript. And what the manuscript contained, it contained some information about some Indian king ordering that there would be a note that during their time that the moon was split. And then she basically dated back and saw what that basically was coinciding with, and saw that that was coming at pretty much the same dating. That manuscript was dated the same time as the timing when اقتربت الساعة وانشق القمر, during the same timing when the Prophet ﷺ was challenged to split the moon. And said that, you know, in India, they were writing in Sanskrit that they had seen the moon split, and they were noting it down. And through the carbonated study that basically she managed to do, and of course there were experts to basically tell us the dating for that manuscript, and she basically, you know, related that to اقتربت الساعة وانشق القمر. Pretty interesting. I don't really know the manuscript and all of that, but of course that was Anne Mary Schimmel. You can go back to her book and really see her research. She's she was I would say a dangerous professor. Really interesting, very very studious. That's the least I could say. Okay, وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ النَّاسِ لَفَاسِقُونَ. And this is, of course, referring to Yahud, but that would also, and most people are basically fasiqin. And even though in the context it was referring to the Jews, but that doesn't necessarily mean that this would only be exclusive to them. So in other words, العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. Let's write that one down. Okay, what is the word that we just said? Remember, العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. So what does that mean? So in general, the theme is in the generalized statement and not necessarily in the reason for the revelation or the reason to why the context and the context for why this was mentioned. Should we put that right there? Here we go. So even though the context was actually referring to the Yahud, but this isn't exclusive to them. So is it true that most people are deviant? The answer is yes, most people are deviant. In other words, the whole idea of following the, let's say, I guess the prevalent opinion, or at least the most liked and preferred opinion, is not necessarily always accurate. That's what Islam says. إن كثيرا من الناس لفاسقون. In fact, most people are deviant. So to consider that since everybody is doing a certain way of practice, that means that I'm safe, as actually in Islam, that's actually a completely wrong premise. The premise in Islam is that most people are actually doing the wrong thing and not the right thing. In other words, even the Prophet ﷺ, in where the Prophet ﷺ, بدأ الإسلام غريبا, Islam started out in a strange way, and will come back in a strange way. فطوبى للغرباء, طوبى للغرباء, at least that's a mudraj, in where that's an addition from the narrator, but at the end, in where بدأ الإسلام غريبا, Islam started out in a strange way, and will come back in a strange way. In other words, we're talking about that it's not necessarily what is prevalent, making it basically a stronger and a more accurate way of life, but in where the Prophet ﷺ was actually telling us, well, Islam started out in a strange way and will come back in a strange way. In other words, the mudraj, basically that the comment from that the narrator, in where tuba al-ghuraba, in glad tidings bring, congratulate those that are strange, the weirdos, because, well, that means they're just basically not following what everybody else is doing, so they are basically going to be perceived as outcasts. They're going to be perceived as doing the wrong thing, but in reality, they could actually be doing the right thing. Yes. Okay, so this is it for today. We definitely went past our time. I just couldn't. Okay, here we go. Inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. Inshallah, we'll continue. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Oh, we got some new names here. We got Khadija, we got Yasmin, and we got a Zoom user right there. And Mrs. Arshad right there, Sister Umayya, and Sister Matina. These are, mashallah, always there. So this is it. I guess no one has any questions. So what I'll do, I will pause the recording, right? Where is it?